Okay, there are some questions about ethnicity. Is the low-carb diet better for some ethnicities? Is there an issue? Someone with an Asian background has asked, thank you, Taryn, if there is any risk switching quickly from a high-carb diet to a low-carb diet with an Asian background?
So I just want to talk about genetics overall. And individualised diet. So everybody says, oh, everything in moderation. One diet can't be right for everybody. So everything in moderation is fine if you want moderate health. But within that confine, I think there still is an ability to personalise a diet, and that's where the ketones come in, because we can work out what level of carbohydrate restriction is needed for somebody to be in ketosis and to be in fat-burning mode. And if you go out to Liverpool and have a look at some of the islander population out there, you'll see there's a very different genetic base. So significant rate of diabetes and metabolic syndrome and all of that, and that almost certainly is genetically mediated. We know that some races are just inherently more insulin resistant when they're on a Western-style diet. So, does race come into it? Absolutely. Does that change the diet that you have? It doesn't change the style of diet, but it changes how strict you need to be on the diet. And in terms of Asians in particular, maybe Rod or Doron can add something. I mean, the only thing that commonly pops up in medical parlance with Asians is a lactase deficiency, which means they are unable to metabolise lactose, the sugar in milk. But in general, besides maybe a slightly increased tendency for insulin resistance, and that's why we actually have different thresholds for diagnosing obesity with body mass index in the Asian population, I really can't see any particular issue.
The countries in the world that have the most type 2 diabetes, China, 100 million people, India, 110 million people. People of Asian origin develop type 2 diabetes at lower BMIs than people of other parts of the world. So clearly there's a genetic thing. What's interesting about that, that has occurred in a period of about 40 years. So there's been changes in the diets in India and China, quite dramatic, to make them the countries with the biggest type 2 diabetes problem. Of course, the obesity is going with that. So clearly there is a genetic component. But the other question that would come out of that, what's changed for them in this period of time to have hardly anybody with type 2 diabetes or obesity now to it becoming very prevalent? And I think the answer would be sugar and processed food has changed dramatically in those.
Lots of dairy we're selling.
Right.
Sugar. So just to finish that, I do orthopaedic outreach, so I lead a surgical team overseas, and we volunteer and go and teach local surgeons at another country how to do some operations. And I typically go to Fiji, which is by most standards a third world country. The diabetes rate over there is 10%, which is, as a population. And that's only happened since the Western diets got introduced to Fiji. Now, in the operating theatres where I go and operate, they run another operating theatre. There's 4 operating theatres running. The one operating theatre, basically all day, every day, is doing below-knee amputations for diabetic complications. And this is a country that didn't have any of this when they were eating their own natural diets. When the Western diet got introduced, which is basically sugar, pasta, bread, processed foods, it's destroyed their entire country, and it's all right through the Polynesian islands. So yes, genetics makes a big difference. They are much, much more sensitive to the sugars, it would seem, than what we are here.
One of the criticisms has been that the traditional Asian diet is high in rice and noodles, which are carbohydrate loaded.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point. I mean, the Asian people have eaten rice for hundreds of years, and they didn't develop these problems. So I think 2 things have happened there. One is the rice has become much more refined, and white rice really came into China in about the 1980s. So before that, they were eating brown rice, and that would have they wouldn't have eaten the same amounts. But secondly, as I mentioned before, starting to have a lot more sugar and other processed foods at that time, I think reasonably explains why Asian people used to be thin, why they're not now, and why they're getting type 2 diabetes.
I think I'd agree that certainly sugar plays a massive role in that. Rice is basically just glucose, glucose, glucose. And we didn't talk about fructose today, but fructose has a particular role in damaging the liver that glucose doesn't play. Only about 20% of the glucose that you take in actually requires metabolising by the liver because it can be taken up in other areas of the body, whereas 100% of the fructose you have is taken up by the liver and processed by the liver. So the capacity of fructose to start this process of fatty liver, and you remember the retinol binding protein 4 and all of that stuff, that happens significantly higher with fructose. And what a lot of people don't realise is that sugar is 50% fructose. We all get worked up about high fructose corn syrup. Now, high fructose corn syrup comes in different formulations. It ranges between 42% fructose and 55% fructose. You know the table sugar that we have in Australia? Exactly 50% fructose. Not much different. So I really think that, if you were only eating rice, and we know that the diets that we give children, they can tolerate complex carbohydrates so long as they don't have as much fructose, much better than adults who are metabolically unhealthy. So it requires the fructose to kickstart the whole process. And I think if they only stayed on rice, then my feeling is that a lot of these people in these countries would probably remain relatively healthy.
Got a couple of questions from the audience.
Yeah, there's one up the back. But don't forget that a lot of these people were working in the fields themselves. They were actually doing manual labour. They were physical exercise all of the time. They weren't sitting at a desk not doing anything either.